Well, I'm happy to finally get to the day where we get to talk about St. Paul, because he was just the most wonderful missionary. And any of us who have ever wanted to be missionaries, we can just learn from St. Paul. He was born in Tarsus, which is now Turkey, and he's a citizen of Rome. That becomes very important in some of his adventures. Now, when I was a young girl, I was in a study group that we did some Bible study, and my sister was in the group too, and she did a map of all of Paul's missionary journeys. Well, I'm one of these people. I look at a map and it looks really cool, but I look away from the map and I don't remember anything on it. So I'm not very good with maps, and I thought that was just amazing that she did a map of Paul's missionary journeys. But probably he moved from Turkey, which is, Tarsus is now Turkey, down to Jerusalem when he was a teenager with his parents. And he was able to study the law with a very famous man named Gamaliel. So let me tell you a little bit about what Gamaliel did long before long before Paul became a Christian. The Sanhedrin was trying to figure out what to do with these new apostles that were running around talking about Jesus being raised from the dead. How do we get rid of them? And so this is what Gamaliel said. He was very wise. He said, "In the present case, I advise you to leave these men alone. Let them go. For if it is their purpose if their purpose or activity is something that humans planned, then it will disappear by itself. But if it is from God, you don't want to find yourselves fighting against God. Let these people go." So Paul didn't listen to any of that good wisdom. Instead, he was all for getting rid of all these Christians because they were ruining the ancient religion, is the way he felt about it. And he held the coats of the people who stoned Stephen and killed the first Christian martyr. And he went around persecuting Christians. He would throw people into jail, and he would go with letters to get them arrested, and men, women, and children. It was just a terrible, terrible time for the Christians, but Christian faith kept growing. More and more people wanted to know about Jesus who had risen from the dead. And you don't just know about Jesus, you actually meet Jesus when you are around a bunch of Christians who are just really excited about Jesus being raised from the dead. But he wanted to wipe out the sect of the Nazarenes, as they called it, the sect of the Nazarenes. So he went up to Damascus, and something happened on the way. He was blinded by some kind of a bright light, and there was a voice, and it said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And Jesus said, "I'm Jesus whom you're persecuting. You're going the wrong direction. Now you're going to be blind for a while, and then you're going to be, someone named Ananias is going to come and visit you. So it's time for you to pray." So Paul was led blind into the city of Damascus, and he prayed. He didn't know what was going on until someone named Ananias came to visit him. Now, Ananias wasn't real happy about coming to visit Paul because he heard about all these people that Paul had thrown into prison or had killed, and he was just kind of terrified. But Jesus said, "No, Paul is praying, and I want you to go lay hands on him and heal him of his blindness, and then he's going to become one of my Christian missionaries." Wow, how amazing. So after word got around in Damascus that Paul had become a Christian, well, for one thing, people had trouble believing that. But then some of the leaders of the Jewish religion in that city decided, this is getting out of hand. We've lost Paul, and he's going to be going around making people want to become Christian. So let's kill him while we have the chance. But word got out to Paul that his missionary journeys were going to be cut short by sudden death. And so he said, let me scoot out of Damascus in a safe way. So they lowered him in a basket over the city walls and snuck him down into Jerusalem. So now there he was in Jerusalem. Now he was taught by Christians, and it was years, you need to know, it was years of teaching and learning about the Christian faith before he was ready to go out as a missionary. Now, his first missionary journey started in Cyprus, and that's an island in the Mediterranean Sea. And since I'm not very good at maps, I can only tell you that it is southeast of Greece. That's as far as we're going to go with that. And then his second missionary journey, he went the first one he went with Barnabas. The second one he went not with Barnabas, but he went with Silas. Now he kind of wanted to go with Barnabas, but Barnabas had this young man named John Mark, who probably wrote the Gospel of Mark, but he was a little unreliable as a teenager, and he had kind of been unreliable in a previous trip, and Paul said, "No, you travel with Mark. I'll catch up with Mark later on when he's a little bit older." But he met a young man named Timothy, and Timothy became also a great missionary. Now, these are the cities they visited in the second journey, and you're going to find these cities in the Bible: Galatia, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus, and those 4 cities are cities to which Paul wrote letters. He wrote to the Galatians, the Thessalonians, the Corinthians, and the Ephesians. Now, on this second missionary journey, there's a great scene in Athens where he's wandering around looking at all these statues of gods, and he says, these people are really religious. But he found a statue to the unknown God. And he says, aha, I see what these people's problem is. They have an unknown God. They don't really know about the God who created heaven and earth. And Paul spent some time telling the people about the God who created heaven and earth and about Jesus who was raised from the dead. And the Greeks really like to listen to new things. And they said, well, come and talk to us some more. We haven't heard this before about being raised from the dead. It turned out that Greece became a great center of Christianity, and much of the New Testament was written in Greek. So his third journey started in Ephesus and ended in Caesarea. Now, this is how Paul describes his missionary journeys. In case you think he was having a really good time on an airplane with hotels and first class passage, no, it wasn't like that. In those days, if you wanted to even travel on a ship, what you had to do was to go down and bargain with the different captains of the different ships and say, where are you going? Can I go? How much does it cost? And it was a lot of trouble. So he said, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. He was keeping count here. I spent a night and a day in the open sea, probably hanging on to a piece of wood. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, and at sea, in danger from false believers, people who were preaching a different gospel that Christ had not been raised. I've labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and I've often gone without food. So this is how Paul remembers his journeys, but he would do anything for Jesus because he loved Jesus so much. But, believe it or not, those three missionary journeys with all the adventures are just the beginning of Paul's adventures, because then he went down to Jerusalem. He had to say goodbye to his friends, and they said, we don't want you to go to Jerusalem. And someone had predicted that in Jerusalem he would be killed. Actually, that turned out not to be the case, but he definitely was arrested when he got to Jerusalem. So he was closeted with the Sanhedrin, which is the judging group of the Jewish religion at that time. And they asked him questions, and sometimes they would do things that were against their own laws, like they'd strike him on the mouth while he was trying to talk. And he said, you're doing that, that's again, you're trying me on the basis of law, and yet that's against the law to strike a prisoner who is answering a simple question. So the Sanhedrin wasn't too happy with him, and they wanted him to be killed. Well, they had a great idea. They said, I'll tell you what, next time we're going to ask for him to be brought down to the Sanhedrin, and we will ask we need to ask more questions. But it turned out what they really were going to do, and Paul's nephew got wind of this, what they were really going to do was kill him as soon as he was out of Roman hands. So, once the centurion and the commander found out about this, they transferred him in the middle of the night to go to a different area where he could be safer. And he testified about Jesus in front of King Felix and his wife Drusilla. And then he went to King Festus and he testified about Jesus. And Felix actually was getting a little nervous hearing about, Jesus coming back from the dead and judging people, and he said, coming back to earth and judging people. And he said, I think I've heard enough of this for one day. I'll call you when it's more convenient for me. And that's one of the great Bible passages where people say, not really convenient for me to think about Jesus right now. I'll do that some other time. But actually, when you hear about Jesus, that's the time to realize that Jesus is, that you really want him to be the center and focus of your life. When you first hear about Jesus, don't waste any time. So he was in a storm. He appealed to Caesar. He said, I appeal to Caesar. So they had to send him all the way to Rome. And because he was a Roman citizen, if he appealed to Caesar, he could go to Rome. And so he was in a storm and a shipwreck. And when he came out of the shipwreck, they found themselves on the island of Malta. And they were drying themselves around a fire, because if you've been in a boat wreck, don't ask me about that. If you've been in a boat wreck, you want to make sure that you get dry right away. So we're drying around a fire, and then a snake crawled out of the fire and fastened itself to his hand, and he shook it off into the flames. So I thought, a snake fastened itself onto him? Does that mean that he's a convict running away from danger and the snake has found him? But he was fine. The snake had not bitten him. So then they decided, well, he not only is not a convict, looked like he is a god. And maybe Silas is a god also. So they decided they were Zeus and Hermes, come down from Olympus, from the heavens, and that they were to worship them and sacrifice to them. And Paul and Silas said, no, please, we're ordinary people. The God of earth that created earth and heaven, that is the God that we worship. Please don't sacrifice to us. Jesus is the sacrifice. Jesus is our God. And so he stayed in Rome 2 years as a prisoner, and that's the way the book of Acts ends. It says he stayed in Rome 2 years as a prisoner. And we think from tradition that he was probably killed at the same time that Peter and many of the other Christians were killed. But that didn't stop the Christian faith. Because the Christian faith is run by Jesus himself, who was raised from the dead and is always looking after us, and the Holy Spirit is protecting the church. They will never fall. So here's the thing to remember from what we've learned from St. Paul from his 13 letters that he wrote. So he wrote about half of the New Testament, which is 27 books. And in his 13 letters, by the way, these letters were written before the Gospels were written. Many of these letters were written. And he said, I preach Christ crucified. So that's one of Paul's biggest statements. I preach Christ crucified. He wasn't going to pretend that Jesus was just a ghost or just pretending to be a person, or he said, I preach Christ crucified, which means that he was a real person. So that's important to remember. And the other thing he said is, if Christ is not raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. He said it doesn't do us any good to be worshiping Christ unless he was raised from the dead. So like our creed says, that he was truly human, truly divine, truly raised from the dead, and lives forever. That's what Paul wanted us to learn, and that's why we remember St. Paul. So thank you for joining me to talk about St. Paul.